An old man was abandoned in a nursing home by his daughter, but when he revealed a secret from his past that she didn't know, the whole family was shocked. The afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, creating a spectacle that Walter watched with tired eyes from the window of the Villa Serenidade nursing home. At 78, his wrinkled face bore the marks of a long life, full of joys and sorrows. Her gnarled fingers absent-mindedly stroked the arm of the rocking chair, a rhythmic movement that echoed the back and forth of her thoughts. As he watched a flock of birds cutting across the horizon, Walter felt a pang of envy. How nice it would be to have that freedom again, to be able to spread his wings and fly away from that place which, although comfortable, was not his home. It wasn't the place where he had imagined spending his last days. Funny how life plays tricks on us, he muttered to himself, a sad smile playing on his thin lips. His mind wandered to the past, to the days of his youth when the world seemed full of possibilities. He remembered how his eyes sparkled when he talked about his dreams of becoming an educator, of making a difference in children's lives. He could almost smell the chalk and hear the excited buzz of a classroom full of students eager to learn. Walter closed his eyes, letting himself be enveloped by these memories. He saw himself younger, full of energy, explaining complex concepts with passion, his students hanging on his every word. He remembered the feeling of accomplishment when he saw the sparkle of understanding in a child's eyes, that magical moment when an idea finally made sense. But then, like waves breaking on the beach, other memories invaded her mind. Decisions made, paths chosen, opportunities missed. The face of his brother Tom appeared in his memory, his eyes full of hurt and disappointment. Walter felt a lump in his throat as he remembered the last time they had seen each other, the harsh words exchanged, the deafening silence that followed. "If I could go back," he whispered to the empty room, his voice laden with regret. The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought Walter out of his reverie. He straightened up in his chair, trying to look more cheerful than he really felt. The door opened and Sarah, his daughter, entered the room. At 45, Sarah was the living image of her deceased mother, with the same piercing green eyes and wavy brown hair. "Hello, Dad," she said, her voice trying to sound casual, but Walter could sense the underlying tension. "Sarah," he replied, nodding. "What a nice surprise." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Sarah walked over to the window, her eyes avoiding her father's gaze. "How are you?" she finally asked, turning to face him. Walter shrugged. "As usual." "The days go by." Sarah nodded, biting her lower lip, a habit she'd had since she was a child when she was nervous. "Anna asked about you," she said, referring to Walter's granddaughter. A spark of joy lit up the old man's eyes. "How is she? Still dreaming of being a teacher?" "Yes," Sarah replied, a reluctant smile appearing on her lips. "She's stubborn like her grandfather." Walter laughed softly, but the sound soon died in his throat. The mention of stubbornness brought up painful memories, times when his own stubbornness had caused cracks in his relationship with Sarah. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice wavering, I wanted to talk about—" But Walter interrupted her, raising a wrinkled hand. "Please, Sarah, not today." Sarah's face closed, the hurt evident in her eyes. "Of course," she said coldly. "It was foolish of me to think we could have an honest conversation." Walter felt a twinge of guilt, but old pride prevented him from saying the words that could begin to heal the wound between them. Instead, he turned to the window again, signaling that the conversation was over. Sarah sighed, defeated. "I'll be back next week," she said, heading for the door. "Take care, Dad." As the door closed behind her, Walter allowed the tears he had been holding back to run down his wrinkled cheeks. The weight of loneliness and regret seemed to crush his chest. That evening, while the other residents of the nursing home gathered in the common room for dinner, Walter remained in his room, rummaging half-heartedly through his meal. His thoughts continued to wander between the past and the present, painting a picture of missed opportunities and unfulfilled dreams. It was the soft sound of a knock on the door that brought him out of his melancholy thoughts. "Come in," he said, expecting to see one of the nurses doing her nightly rounds. To his surprise, it was Donna Edith who entered, one of Villa Serenidade's oldest residents. At 82, Mrs. Edith was known for her inexhaustible energy and infectious smile. "Good evening, Walter," she said, her eyes sparkling behind her thin-framed glasses. "I missed you at dinner. I've brought you some pudding for dessert, just in case." Walter smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Edith. You're very kind." Mrs. Edith settled into the chair next to Walter's bed, placing the pot of pudding on the bedside table. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "when I was young, I used to think that getting old meant giving up on dreams. But I've learned that it's never too late to dream, Walter." Walter looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Well," continued Mrs. Edith, "I spent 40 years as a teacher. I thought that when I retired, my life as an educator was over. But here I am, at 82, teaching knitting and telling stories to the children who visit the hospice at weekends. Life always surprises us with new opportunities, if we are willing to embrace them." Mrs. Edith's words touched something deep inside Walter. He found himself sharing with her his old dreams of being an educator, of opening a school for underprivileged children. As she spoke, Walter felt a spark of something he hadn't felt for a long time: hope. "You know, Walter," said Mrs. Edith, taking his wrinkled hand between hers, "maybe it's not too late to make this dream come true, one way or another." When Mrs. Edith left, leaving Walter with his thoughts and a half-eaten pot of pudding, something had changed in the air of the room. The melancholy that had previously hung like a heavy cloud seemed to have dissipated a little, giving way to a light breeze of possibility. That night, before going to sleep, Walter took out a sheet of paper and a pen. With trembling but determined hands, he began to write, "Dear Anna, there's so much I want to tell you, so many dreams I want to share." The words flowed, carrying with them years of unexpressed love and long-buried hopes. Walter wrote until his eyes were too heavy to stay open. He fell asleep with the pen still in his hand, a soft smile on his lips, dreaming of classrooms full of laughter and the sound of chalk on the blackboard. Outside, the moon bathed the Villa Serenidade asylum in its silvery light, as if blessing the rebirth of a long-forgotten dream. Dawn brought a new energy to the Villa Serenidade asylum. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains of Walter's room, illuminating the crumpled paper on his bedside table, the letter he had started writing to Anna the night before. Walter woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt for years. He sat up in bed, his eyes fixed on the unfinished letter. The words he had written, although few, seemed to have opened a floodgate in his heart. Long repressed memories and emotions now flowed freely, eager to find expression. With a determined sigh, Walter got up and got dressed. Today, he decided, would be different. Today, he wouldn't be reclusive in his room, ruminating on the past. Today, he would take a step towards the future. As he left his room, Walter was greeted by the lively buzz coming from the common room. It was group activity day, and the residents of the nursing home had gathered for various workshops. The sound of laughter and animated conversation filled Walter with a curiosity he hadn't felt for a long time. "Walter," Mrs. Edith's cheerful voice called out to him. She was sitting in a circle with other residents, knitting needles in her skillful hands. "Come and join us." For a moment, Walter hesitated. His instinct was to retreat, to go back to the safety of his room. But then he remembered Mrs. Edith's words the night before. "It's never too late to dream," she had said. With a shy smile, Walter approached the group. "I don't know how to knit," he admitted, taking a seat next to Mrs. Edith. She laughed, a melodious sound that warmed Walter's heart. "No one is born knowing, dear. We're here to learn." The next few hours passed in a blur of colourful threads, laughter and shared stories. Walter discovered that his hands, although wrinkled and a little shaky, were still capable of creating. The scarf he was trying to knit was far from perfect, full of loose stitches and holes, but each crooked thread represented a step towards something new. As he knitted, Walter found himself sharing stories of his days as a young teacher, before life took him down other paths. He talked about the children he had taught, the challenges he had faced, and the moments of joy that teaching had brought him. "You talk about teaching with so much love, Walter," commented Mrs. Edith, her eyes shining with understanding. "Why did you stop?" The question hit Walter like a punch in the gut. For a moment, his hands stopped moving, the knitting needles hanging in the air. The common room seemed to disappear around him, and he found himself transported back in time. "My brother, Tom," Walter began, his voice low and charged with emotion. "He was also a teacher. We were competitive, always trying to prove who was the best." Walter paused, swallowing before continuing. There was an opportunity, a new school opening in the neighboring town. "We both applied to be the principal. I did things I'm not proud of to get the job." The silence that followed was heavy with regret and unresolved pain. Mrs. Edith gently placed her hand on Walter's, a silent gesture of understanding and support. "I got the job," Walter continued, his voice almost a whisper, "but I lost my brother. Tom never forgave me, and I found that victory tasted bitter. I couldn't look at that school without remembering what I had done. So I gave up. I gave it all up." The words hung in the air, heavy with regret and shame. Walter felt the tears burning in his eyes, threatening to fall. Then he felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. He looked up and saw the compassionate faces of his fellow residents, each carrying their own stories of regret and second chances. "Oh, Walter," said Donna Edith softly, "the past has a way of imprisoning us, doesn't it? But you know, the key to that prison is in our hands. Maybe it's time to use that key." Mrs. Edith's words echoed in Walter's mind for the rest of the day. As he walked back to his room that afternoon, he felt different. The weight of the past was still there, but now it seemed lighter, as if he had shared some of that burden with his new friends. Sitting down at his desk, Walter picked up the unfinished letter to Anna. With new determination, he began to write, "Dear Anna, there is so much I want to tell you, so many dreams I want to share. But first, I need to tell you a story about two brothers, about choices and consequences, about regret and, I hope, about redemption." The words flowed from Walter's pen, spilling over the paper like a long-dammed river. He wrote about Tom, about the rivalry that had consumed them, about the mistake he had made and the price he had paid. And for the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to dream of a different future. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Sarah was sitting in her kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her. Her thoughts were fixed on the tense visit she had paid her father the day before. The distance between them seemed unbridgeable, a chasm created by years of silence and resentment. "Mom," Anna's voice snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing in her the same curious and determined eyes that her father had when he was young. "I'm fine, dear. Just thinking about Grandpa." Anna sat down next to her mother, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is he still mad at you?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know if he's angry, Anna. I think we're both lost. We don't know how to communicate anymore." "Maybe," Anna said slowly. "You need a bridge." Sarah looked at her daughter, puzzled. "A bridge?" Anna nodded, her face lighting up with an idea. "Yes, something you two have in common, something that can bring you back together." Anna's words stayed with Sarah for the rest of the night. As she prepared for bed, she couldn't help but think of her father alone in that asylum. There was so much she wanted to say, so many questions she wanted to ask, but fear and pride always seemed to get in the way. That night, both Walter and Sarah fell asleep with thoughts of reconciliation in their minds. In the Villa Serenidade asylum and in Sarah's home, father and daughter dreamed of bridges over troubled waters, of hands outstretched in gestures of forgiveness. And somewhere between them, Walter's letters to Anna floated like leaves in the wind, carrying the seeds of a change that was just beginning to sprout. The morning sun seeped through the gaps in Sarah's bedroom curtains, finding her already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her eyes were fixed on an old framed photograph on the wall, her and her father, Walter, smiling in front of an elementary school. The image was of a happier time, before the sorrows and silences came between them. Anna's words the night before echoed in her mind. "You need a bridge." Sarah sighed, putting her cup down on the bedside table. A bridge. But how to build a bridge over years of resentment and unspoken words? Meanwhile, in the Villa Serenidade nursing home, Walter woke up with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt for years. The pile of letters he had written to Anna during the night rested on his desk, each page an attempt to explain, to ask for forgiveness, to reconnect with the family he had distanced himself from. Walter dressed carefully, choosing a shirt that Sarah had given him a few birthdays ago. It was a small gesture, but he hoped it could be the start of something. With the folded letters carefully in his pocket, he made his way to the common room, where Mrs. Edith and the other residents were already gathered for breakfast. "Good morning, Walter," Mrs. Edith greeted him with a warm smile. "You seem different today. There's a sparkle in your eyes." Walter smiled shyly, taking a seat next to her. "I think I'm starting to see things from a new perspective, Edith, thanks to you and the others here." As they shared breakfast, Walter found himself telling Mrs. Edith about the letters he had written to Anna. "I don't know if I'll have the courage to send them," he admitted, the insecurity evident in his voice. Mrs. Edith placed her wrinkled hand on his. "Walter, dear, courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. These letters could be the bridge your family needs." Mrs. Edith's words stayed with Walter all morning. After breakfast, he joined a group of residents who were planning a small community garden in the nursing home's garden. As they discussed which vegetables to plant, Walter found himself thinking about how cultivating relationships was similar to tending a garden. It required patience, care, and the willingness to face the weeds that would inevitably emerge. Across town, Sarah was in her office, trying to concentrate on her work, but her mind kept going back to her father and the conversation she'd had with Anna. She looked at the phone on her desk, considering calling the asylum. But what would she say? How would she begin to rebuild a relationship that had been frayed for so long? Then her phone rang, startling her. It was the number for the Villa Serenidade nursing home. Her heart racing, Sarah answered. "Hello?" "Sarah?" Her father's voice sounded on the other end of the line, hesitant and a little shaky. I was hoping we could talk." The silence that followed seemed to carry the weight of all the years of estrangement between them. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Of course, Dad," she finally replied. "I'd like that." The conversation that followed was awkward and full of uncomfortable pauses, but beneath the surface, there was a current of hope. Walter talked about the letters he had written to Anna, asking if Sarah thought it would be a good idea to send them. Sarah, for her part, shared a little about Anna's work at school and how she often talked about her grandfather. "She has a passion for teaching," said Sarah, a smile evident in her voice. Walter felt his heart clench with a mixture of pride and regret. "I wish I'd been there more," he admitted, his voice low. "It's never too late, Dad," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the sincerity in her words. When they hung up, they both felt as if a small brick had been laid in the foundation of a bridge they were just beginning to build. That afternoon, Walter took part in a storytelling session at the nursing home. Inspired by his conversation with Sarah, he volunteered to tell a story, something he hadn't done for years. He chose to tell about his first days as a teacher, about the joy of seeing a child understand a difficult concept for the first time. As he spoke, Walter felt something awaken inside him, a passion that had lain dormant for a long time. He saw in the eyes of his fellow residents the same sparkle of interest and curiosity that he used to see in the eyes of his students. And at that moment, he knew that he still had something to offer. He could still make a difference in someone's life. After the session, Mrs. Edith approached Walter, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Walter, you have a gift," she said, squeezing his hand. "Don't let it stay hidden again." Mrs. Edith's words stayed with Walter for the rest of the day. As he prepared for bed that night, he picked up a new piece of paper and began to write. But this time, it wasn't a letter to Anna. It was an outline of a plan to bring education and hope to the Villa Serenidade asylum. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting in the kitchen of her house, a cup of tea forgotten in front of her. Anna walked in, immediately noticing her mother's pensive expression. "Mom, is everything all right?" Sarah looked at her daughter, a small smile forming on her lips. "Yes, dear. In fact, I think things could get even better. How about we visit Grandpa this weekend?" Anna's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? Can we take my school project to show him?" Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of emotion at seeing her daughter's joy. "I think he'd love that." That night, in different parts of the city, Walter, Sarah, and Anna fell asleep with a renewed sense of hope. The seeds of change that had been planted were beginning to sprout, and although the road ahead was still uncertain, there was a shared feeling that they were moving in the right direction. At the Villa Serenidade nursing home, Walter's letters to Anna rested on his desk, ready to be sent. At Sarah's house, a backpack was being prepared for the visit to her grandfather, and somewhere between them, invisible bridges were being built, brick by brick, word by word, hope by hope. As the night progressed, the moon cast its soft light over the city, illuminating the paths that converged, ready to unite a family that had long been separated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities for healing and reconciliation. And for the first time in a long time, Walter, Sarah, and Anna were ready to face this future together. Saturday dawned with a promise of change hanging in the air. At the Villa Serenidade nursing home, Walter woke up earlier than usual, a mixture of anxiety and expectation making his heart beat faster. Today was the day of Sarah and Anna's visit, and he couldn't remember the last time he had felt so nervous and hopeful at the same time. With care, Walter dressed in his best shirt and ran a comb through his grey hair. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the letters he had written to Anna on his desk. He still wasn't sure if he would have the courage to deliver them, but he felt it was important to have them close by. On the other side of town, Sarah and Anna were also preparing for their visit. Anna was bouncing around the house, excited at the prospect of seeing her grandfather and showing off her school project. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a knot in her stomach grow as the time for departure approached. "What if he doesn't want to see us?" Sarah muttered to herself, as she prepared a small basket of her father's favorite cookies. "He'll love it, Mum," Anna replied, having heard her mother's low comment. "Grandpa always likes it when we visit." Sarah smiled at her daughter, admiring her unwavering optimism. "You're right, dear. Let's stay positive." When they arrived at the nursing home, they were greeted by Mrs. Edith, who was waiting for them at the reception desk with a warm smile. "Sarah, Anna, how nice to see you," she greeted them warmly. "Walter is so excited about your visit. He's waiting for you in the garden." Sarah felt her heart squeeze when she heard this. Her father, excited to see them. It was something that hadn't happened for a long time. As they walked towards the garden, Anna chattered excitedly about her school project, a miniature model of a solar system that she had built. Sarah listened with half an ear, her mind focused on the imminent meeting with her father. Walter was sitting on a bench in the garden, looking at the flowers he and the other residents had planted over the last few weeks. When he saw Sarah and Anna approaching, he stood up, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Sarah, Anna," he greeted them, his voice quivering with emotion. "It's so good to see you." Anna ran to hug her grandfather, her contagious energy breaking the initial tension. "Grandpa, look what I did for school," Walter laughed, a sound Sarah realized she hadn't heard in years. "Show me, dear," he said, sitting back down on the bench and pulling Anna to his side. Sarah watched as her father and daughter interacted, feeling a mixture of joy and sadness. It was a scene she wished she had seen more often over the years. "Sarah," her father's voice brought her out of her thoughts, "sit with us." With a lump in her throat, Sarah joined them on the bench. For a few moments, they sat in silence, just listening to Anna enthusiastically explain her solar system project. "That's amazing, Anna," Walter praised, his eyes shining with pride. "You've certainly inherited your mother's passion for learning, and maybe a bit of your old grandfather's too." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard these words. "Dad," she began, her voice breaking. Walter held up a hand, gently interrupting her. "Sarah, there's something I need to show you, that I need to show you both." He stood up slowly, asking them to follow him to his room. There, on the desk, were the letters he had written over the last few days. "I started writing these letters to Anna," he explained, his voice low and emotional. "But I realized that they're as much for you as for her, Sarah. They're my attempts to explain Maui, to ask for forgiveness, to try to mend what I broke so many years ago." Sarah looked at the letters, feeling the weight of years of silence and hurt contained in those pages. With trembling hands, she picked one up. Can I read it?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Walter nodded, his eyes full of unshed tears. "Please." As Sarah read, Anna watched curiously, sensing that something important was happening, even if she didn't fully understand. Walter's words spoke of regret, of lost dreams, of a brother with whom he had lost touch, of a career abandoned out of guilt and shame. "Oh, Dad," Sarah sobbed, the tears now streaming freely down her face. "I didn't know. I never understood." Walter approached hesitantly, opening his arms. Sarah didn't hesitate, throwing herself into her father's embrace. Years of hurt and resentment beginning to dissolve in that moment of shared vulnerability. Anna, sensing the importance of the moment, joined in, wrapping her mother and grandfather in her small arms. For several minutes, they stayed like that, a family reconnecting, healing long-open wounds. When they finally parted, there was a lightness in the air, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "I have so much to tell you," Walter said, wiping away tears, "about my brother Tom, about why I stopped teaching, and about a new dream I'm starting to have." Sarah took her father's hand, feeling the fragility and strength in those wrinkled fingers. "We want to hear everything, Dad. There's no more hurry, no more secrets between us." Meanwhile, Mrs. Edith watched discreetly from the doorway, a gentle smile on her lips. She saw the seeds she had helped plant beginning to blossom, a family beginning to heal. The rest of the afternoon passed in a mixture of laughter and tears, stories shared and secrets revealed. Walter told her about his brother Tom, about the rivalry that separated them, about the remorse he had carried for so many years. Sarah, for her part, shared her own fears and insecurities, the reasons behind her estrangement. Anna listened with a wisdom beyond her years, occasionally offering a hug or a word of comfort. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the asylum, the little family felt they had taken the first steps on a healing journey. Before Sarah and Anna left, Walter surprised them with an announcement. I've been thinking," he began, a glint of enthusiasm in his eyes. "What if we could bring a bit of education to the asylum? Maybe I can teach again somehow." Sarah looked at her father, seeing in him the passionate teacher she remembered from her childhood. "That would be wonderful, Dad. And I'm sure Anna would love to help, wouldn't you?" Anna nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, we can do projects together, Grandpa." When Sarah and Anna finally left, there was a sense of new beginnings in the air. Walter stood at the door of the nursing home, waving until the car disappeared from sight. He felt exhausted, but in a good way, as if he had run a marathon and finally crossed the finish line. Returning to his room, Walter found Mrs. Edith waiting for him. "So?" she said with a knowing smile. "How was it?" Walter smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his whole face. It was a start. Edith. A new beginning. That night, in 3 different places in the city, Walter, Sarah, and Anna fell asleep with lighter hearts and brighter dreams. The future was still uncertain, but now they knew they would face it together, a family reunited, ready to write a new chapter in their shared history. The weeks that followed Sarah and Anna's visit brought a palpable change to the Villa Serenidade nursing home. Walter, invigorated by reconciliation with his family and the prospect of a new purpose, seemed to have regained a spark of youth. His steps were firmer, his eyes brighter, and his smile, once rare, was now a frequent sight in the asylum corridors. On a sunny Wednesday morning, Walter summoned up the courage to present his idea to the nursing home's administration. With Donna Edith by his side for moral support, he laid out his plan to start an educational program for the residents. "You know," Walter began, his voice trembling slightly with a mixture of nervousness and enthusiasm, I spent most of my life believing that I had missed my chance to make a difference, but now I see that it's never too late to start again. The director of the nursing home, Mrs. Oliveira, listened attentively as Walter described his vision. Classes on a variety of subjects, from literature to basic sciences, adapted to the needs and interests of the elderly residents. He talked about how continuous learning could improve the residents' quality of life, providing mental stimulation and a renewed sense of purpose. And it wouldn't just be for the residents, Walter added, his enthusiasm growing as he spoke. We could invite children from the community to some classes, create a bridge between generations. When Walter finished his presentation, there was a moment of silence. Mrs. Oliveira looked at Donna Edith, who nodded with an encouraging smile. Mr. Mendez, Mrs. Oliveira finally said, a smile forming on her lips. I think you've just given our nursing home a new lease of life. Let's make it happen. News of the new educational program spread quickly throughout the nursing home. Many residents, inspired by Walter's enthusiasm, offered to share their own skills and knowledge. Mrs. Edith volunteered to teach knitting and crochet, while Mr. João, a former accountant, offered to teach basic mathematics and personal finance. Walter plunged headlong into the preparations. He spent hours in the asylum's small library, refreshing his knowledge and planning lessons. Sarah and Anna became frequent visitors, bringing books and school materials donated by Anna's school. On one of these visits, while Walter was showing Sarah the space that the administration had designated for classes, he paused, his expression turning serious. Sarah, he began, his voice low and emotional. I wanted to thank you. Sarah looked at her father in surprise. For what, Dad? For not giving up on me, Walter replied, tears forming in his eyes. For bringing Anna here that day. For giving me a second chance to be a father and a grandfather. Sarah felt her own throat tighten with emotion. She took her father's hand, feeling the wrinkles and calluses that told the story of a long and not always easy life. Oh, Dad, she said softly, we're family. We always will be. I'm so happy that we're finally reconnecting. At that moment, Anna rushed into the room carrying a colorful poster she had made for her grandfather's first class. Grandpa, look at this, she exclaimed, holding up the poster with pride. It's to welcome your new pupils. Walter laughed, discreetly wiping away his tears. It's wonderful, dear. I'm sure they'll all love it. As Walter hung Anna's poster on the wall, Sarah couldn't help noticing how her father seemed more alive, more present than he had been in years. It was as if the weight of regrets and missed opportunities had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The big day had finally arrived. Walter's first class was scheduled for a Monday afternoon. The theme was the magic of poetry, something he hoped would spark the residents' imagination and creativity. When Walter entered the makeshift classroom, he was surprised to see that it was full, not just with residents of the nursing home, but also with some young faces, children from the local community who had been invited to take part. Heart-pounding, Walter positioned himself at the front of the room. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling the weight of years of doubt and regret. But then his eyes met those of Mrs. Edith, who was smiling encouragingly from the front row. He saw Sarah and Anna standing at the back of the room, both with proud smiles. Taking a deep breath, Walter began, Welcomes everyone. Today we're going to explore the wonderful world of poetry together. As Walter spoke, his confidence grew. He saw the residents' eyes light up with interest, heard the children's laughter in response to a particularly witty pun. He saw generations connecting through words, through the shared beauty of a well-constructed verse. At the end of the class, as the participants left animatedly discussing the poems they had read and created, Walter felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mrs. Oliveira. Mr. Mendez, she said, her voice full of admiration. That was truly inspiring. You brought something special to our asylum today. Walter smiled, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and elation. Thank you, Mrs. Oliveira. That means a lot to me. That evening, after Sarah and Anna had left and the asylum had calmed down, Walter sat in his room reflecting on the day. He picked up one of the letters he had written to Anna weeks ago, rereading the words he had written about his lost dreams and regrets. With a smile, Walter took out a new sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Anna, today, I learned something incredible. I learned that it's never too late to start again, to pursue your dreams, to make a difference. Today, my dear granddaughter, I became a teacher again, and it was wonderful. As Walter wrote, he felt as if he was not only documenting his day, but rewriting his own story, a story that, he now realized, still had many exciting chapters to come. Outside his window, the moon shone down on the Villa Serenidade asylum, its soft light illuminating a world of possibilities that Walter was only just beginning to rediscover. And somewhere in that quiet night, he could almost hear the distant echo of laughter and poetry, the promise of new horizons opening up before him. Autumn arrived at the Villa Serenidade nursing home, bringing with it an explosion of color and renewed energy. Walter's educational program had blossomed in recent months, becoming the beating heart of the community. Classes now covered a variety of topics, from literature and history to gardening and basic technology, with residents and community volunteers sharing their knowledge and passions. On one particularly busy afternoon, Walter was conducting a class on local history when he noticed an unfamiliar face among the participants. He was a middle-aged man with grey hair and curious eyes that seemed to assess every detail in the room. After the lesson, the stranger approached Walter, holding out his hand. Mr. Mendez, my name is Ricardo Alves. I'm a journalist with Diario da Cidade. I've heard about the incredible work you're doing here, and I'd like to do a story on the program. Walter felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Oh, well, that's very kind, Mr. Alves, but I don't know if we're that interesting. Ricardo smiled, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. On the contrary, Mr. Mendez, what you're doing here is extraordinary. It's a story of renewal, of purpose in old age. It's exactly the kind of positive news our city needs. Before Walter could reply, Mrs. Edith appeared at his side, a sly smile on her wrinkled face. Walter, dear, don't be modest. What you've built here deserves to be recognized. With a sigh of surrender, Walter agreed to collaborate on the story. In the days that followed, Ricardo became a constant presence at the nursing home, interviewing residents, observing classes, and documenting the transformation that the program had brought to the community. Sarah and Anna were thrilled to hear the news. Dad, this is wonderful, exclaimed Sarah during one of her visits. You deserve this recognition. Anna, for her part, was already planning how to decorate her room with clippings from the newspaper. I'm going to show everyone at school that my grandfather is a celebrity. Walter laughed at his granddaughter's antics, but he couldn't help feeling a twinge of worry. All this attention made him a little uncomfortable. He hadn't started the show looking for recognition, but as a way of making sense of his last years and making amends for past mistakes. The story was published on a Sunday morning, occupying the front page of the culture section of Diario da Cidade. The headline proclaimed in bold letters, "Revolution in the Third Age, How a Retired Teacher is Transforming Lives at the Villa Serenidade Asylum." The article was a celebration of the program and of Walter, describing in moving detail how the initiative had revitalized the asylum and created bridges between generations. It included moving testimonials from residents and family members, color photos of the classes in action, and a brief biography of Walter that painted him as a modest and inspiring hero. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The nursing home's phone kept ringing, with people wanting to know more about the program and how they could contribute or participate. Other nursing homes in the region began to get in touch, interested in replicating the initiative. Walter found himself at the center of a hurricane of attention he had never expected or wanted. However, not all the attention was positive. One afternoon, a few days after the story was published, Walter received a phone call that made his blood run cold. "Walter, is that you, bro?" The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, even after so many years. It was Tom, his brother. "Tom?" Walter answered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect." "Of course you didn't expect it." Tom's voice sounded bitter. "After all, you've moved on with your life, haven't you? You've become the great hero, the inspiring teacher. Well, I suppose you didn't mind mentioning your failed brother in this beautiful story of redemption, did you?" Tom's words hit Walter like a punch in the gut. All the old feelings of guilt and shame that he thought he had overcome surfaced again. "Tom, I'm sorry. I should have gotten in touch. I should have tried to patch things up between us." "Spare me your apologies, Walter," Tom interrupted. "I just want you to know that not everyone has bought your saint story. I know who you really are, and I'm not going to let you rewrite the past to make yourself look like a hero." Before Walter could reply, Tom hung up, leaving him dazed and trembling. In the days that followed, Walter found himself battling a wave of depression. The joy and purpose he had found seemed to have been tarnished by his brother's bitter words. He began to withdraw, cancelling classes and avoiding social interactions. Sarah, noticing the change in her father's behavior, decided to intervene. One Saturday afternoon, she showed up at the nursing home with Anna, determined to find out what was going on. "Dad," she said, sitting down next to Walter in his room. "What's going on? You don't seem yourself lately?" Walter hesitated, but his daughter's worried look and the unconditional love in Anna's eyes finally broke down his defenses. With a deep sigh, he told Sarah about Tom's call and how it had awakened all his old demons. Sarah listened in silence, her heart squeezing as she saw the pain in her father's eyes. When Walter had finished, she took his hands in hers. "Dad," she began softly, "what happened in the past between you and Uncle Tom was sad and difficult, but look at everything you've built here. Look at all the lives you're touching. It doesn't erase the past, but it shows that you've grown, that you've learned from your mistakes." Anna, who had listened quietly until then, came over and hugged her grandfather. "Grandpa, you're my hero, no matter what anyone says." His granddaughter's simple and sincere words hit Walter deeply. He hugged Anna back, feeling the tears start to fall. "Thank you, my darlings," he whispered. I think I lost sight of what really matters for a moment." That evening, after Sarah and Anna had left, Walter sat down at his desk and began to write a letter. Not to Anna this time, but to Tom. It was a letter of apology, of explanation, of a brother asking for a second chance. As he wrote, Walter felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know if Tom would reply or if they would ever be able to completely repair their relationship, but he knew he was doing the right thing, facing his past head-on instead of running away from it. The next morning, Walter woke up with a new determination. He had a family that loved him, a purpose that inspired him, and a community that counted on him. Tom's bitter words still hurt, but they no longer paralyzed him. When Walter entered the classroom that morning, he was greeted by warm smiles and expectant looks. Taking a deep breath, he began, "Good morning, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about second chances and the power of forgiveness." As he spoke, Walter felt a renewed strength growing inside him. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more storms to face, but now he had a fortress, built with the love of his family, the support of his community, and the strength he had discovered within himself. And this fortress, he knew, could withstand any storm. Winter had arrived at the Villa Serenidade asylum, covering the world outside in a blanket of white and silence. Inside, however, there was a warmth and vibrancy that no amount of cold could diminish. Walter's educational program had become an integral part of community life, growing and evolving in ways that no one could have predicted. On a cold Saturday morning, Walter was in his room, rereading for the 100th time the letter he had sent to Tom weeks ago. There had been no reply, and Walter oscillated between hope and resignation. He knew he had done what he could to reach out to his brother. The rest was beyond his control. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Edith, her face lit up with a mysterious smile. "Walter, dear," she said, "there's someone here to see you." Intrigued, Walter followed Mrs. Edith into the common room. His heart almost stopped when he saw who was waiting for him. Tom, his brother, was standing by the window, watching the snow fall outside. When he heard Walter enter, he turned around. The years had not been kind to Tom. His face was more wrinkled than Walter remembered. His shoulders bowed as if they were carrying a great weight. For a moment, the two brothers just stared at each other, decades of hurt, regret, and unspoken words hanging between them. It was Tom who broke the silence. "Hello, Walter," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I got your letter." Walter took a hesitant step towards his brother. "Tom, I'm so glad you came." Tom nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but your letter, well, it made me realize that maybe it's time to leave the past behind." In the hours that followed, the brothers talked as they hadn't for decades. They talked about the past, about mistakes made and opportunities missed, but they also talked about the present, about the lives they had built and the lessons they had learned. "You know," Tom said at one point, "when I read that article about you in the paper, I was furious. I thought you were trying to play the hero, to erase what you had done. But now, seeing all this," he gestured to the asylum, "I understand that you've really changed, and maybe I need to change too." Walter felt his heart fill with a mixture of joy and relief. "It's never too late to start again, Tom. I learned that here." That afternoon, Sarah and Anna arrived for their usual Saturday visit. The surprise and excitement on their faces at seeing Tom was palpable. Anna, with her characteristic innocence and enthusiasm, quickly embraced her new great-uncle, bombarding him with questions about her life and her own experiences as a teacher. As he watched his family gather, Walter felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The circle that had been broken so many years ago was finally closing. In the weeks that followed, Tom became a frequent presence at the nursing home. He began attending Walter's classes, sometimes as a student, sometimes offering his own perspectives as a retired educator. The dynamic between the brothers, once marked by competition, was now one of collaboration and mutual respect. The program continued to grow and evolve. Inspired by the success at Villa Serenidade, other nursing homes in the region began to implement similar programs. Walter and Tom were invited to give talks, sharing their experiences and inspiring others to see old age not as an end, but as a new beginning. On a sunny spring afternoon, almost a year after the program began, the Villa Serenidade nursing home organized a big celebration. Residents, family members, volunteers and community members gathered to celebrate not only the success of the educational program, but also the many lives that had been touched and transformed along the way. At the center of it all was Walter, surrounded by his now extended family, Sarah, Anna, Tom, Donna Edith, and so many others who had become part of his life. As he watched the people around him, chatting animatedly, sharing stories and laughter, Walter felt a wave of gratitude so intense that it almost left him breathless. Sarah approached, putting an arm around his father's shoulders. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, noticing the emotion in his eyes. Walter smiled, a smile that lit up his whole face. "I've never been better, darling. You know, I spent so many years regretting the past, fearing the future. But now I understand that every moment, every choice has brought us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." Anna joined them, her eyes shining with excitement. Grandpa, guess what? The principal of my school wants us to start a program where students visit nursing homes and do activities with the elderly. She said she was inspired by your project." Walter laughed, pulling his granddaughter into a hug. "That's wonderful, Anna. See, what we started here is spreading, touching even more lives." Tom approached, carrying a small box. "Walter," he said, his voice laced with emotion, "I found this among my old things. I thought you might like to have it back." Walter opened the box carefully and felt his heart skip a beat. Inside was an old teacher's whistle, the same one he and Tom had shared in their early teaching days. "Oh, Tom," Walter whispered, holding the whistle reverently. "I thought this had been lost years ago." Tom smiled, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. "It's never too late to recover what's been lost, is it?" At that moment, surrounded by his family and friends, holding a tangible symbol of his past and present, Walter felt that his life had finally come full circle. All the regrets, all the sorrows, all the missed opportunities had led him to this moment of fullness and peace. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the asylum had quietened down, Walter sat down in his room to write one last letter. This time, it wasn't to Anna or Tom or anyone in particular. It was a letter to himself, to the Walter of the past who had lost his way, and to the Walter of the future who would continue to grow and learn. "Dear me," he wrote, "today I learned that life is a continuous journey of learning and growing. That it's never too late to fix mistakes, to chase dreams, to make a difference. That family is not just the one we are born into, but the one we build along the way. And above all, that the true legacy we leave is not in the great achievements, but in the small moments of kindness, in the lives we touch, in the love we share." When he had finished writing, Walter carefully folded the letter and placed it on his bedside table. Tomorrow would be a new day, bringing new challenges and opportunities. But now, for the first time in many years, Walter was truly looking forward to what the future held. As he prepared for bed, Walter looked out of the window. The full moon was bathing the world outside in its soft light, and he could see the first signs of spring emerging on the trees in the garden. A new cycle was beginning, full of promise and possibility. And Walter, with his heart full of gratitude and hope, was ready to embrace it with open arms. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.